Hey guys, do you know someone considering renting their property as an Airbnb? I have worked with Rental Advisor for over a decade, and Rental Advisor provides free rental projections to prospective owners, realtors, and investors for any property in the US. So if you know someone considering getting into the vacation rental industry, have them email management@myrentaladvisor.com to get their free revenue projections. So recently, Jeff McCullough, a Protestant pastor, has been reading the Book of Mormon and documenting what he has been finding. It's been interesting to see him find the same anachronistic language and issues that I remember finding when I first read the Book of Mormon seriously.
In the last few chapters of 2nd Nephi, Nephi speaks very specifically on topics such as baptism, the coming of the Holy Ghost, even speaking in tongues. And all of that even summarizes one of my biggest takeaways of 2nd Nephi, and that is there's a significant amount of New Testament language that exists here in 2nd Nephi that other biblical prophecies that we'll find in the Bible did not use. The post-exilic prophets who were anticipating the coming of a Messiah, who were doing things like rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, were anticipating a lot of the same things that you'll see here in 2nd Nephi pertaining to a Messiah and some of those other things, but not nearly with the level of detail. So I found that interesting. If anything, it felt a little bit to me like Joseph was taking all of these very complex New Testament ideas that he would have known quite well, and he was putting them 550 years before the New Testament even was written, and claiming that it originated at that time.
It's very, very clear that the Book of Mormon is filled with New Testament ideas and language, as well as other things that don't belong in an ancient work. These are known as anachronisms. But please know, this is nothing new, and thoughtful saints have known about these things for a long time. One of my favorite LDS theologians is Blake Ostler, and he recently was discussing these issues on his podcast.
The King James Bible, I think it's just beyond dispute that the King James Bible was relied upon. And, it's the New Testament as well as the Old Testament. And books that were written well after Lehi would have left Jerusalem, such as, for instance, the Book of Mormon, interestingly enough, never quotes from 3rd Isaiah, which I believe are chapters 55 through 56. It does quote from 2nd Isaiah, chapters 49 through 54. And those are supposed to have been written after Lehi left Jerusalem, so how could it be quoted? But you've already got the problem. I mean, the Book of Mormon quotes the New Testament liberally, uses New Testament phraseology liberally throughout. And so there's no question that the Book of Mormon is influenced to a great extent by the language of the King James Bible. The stories in the Book of Mormon are dependent on versions of the King James Bible, and books in the Bible that were written after the Book of Mormon, or at least after Lehi left Jerusalem, and couldn't have been an influence. There can be no question that there are modern influences of the language of the Book of Mormon, given that. The use of the term, so for instance, to refer to those that are at Jerusalem as Jews, is an anachronistic usage in language. The way that baptism is presented in the Book of Mormon is very clearly a Christian baptism at a certain point. The earliest references to baptism are not a fully Christian baptism, but even before the time of Christ, the most developed theology of baptism is actually in 2nd Nephi, where it talks about a fully developed Christian baptism. And there's nothing like that in ancient Judaism to that extent. The views of salvation in the Book of Mormon, the views of atonement, are extremely Christian. But it's strange that there's a concept of an afterlife in the Book of Mormon, it seems to me, because there really isn't that kind of developed concept of an afterlife. But then it's presented as a new kind of revelation to Lehi in any event. But the concepts as they're discussed in the Book of Mormon just really don't fit within a 19th century framework. And, I could go through a whole bunch of them, and I discuss them at length, but those that seem to have to be developed in much more Christian sense in the Book of Mormon than anything that we could possibly expect have to do with the way that it talks about salvation, being born again, receiving the name of Christ, that kind of discussion. The notion of the fall of Adam as a fortunate fall is a development that took place only later in patristic literature, of course, made famous in Paradise Lost. The atonement, as is discussed in the Book of Mormon, is a developed Christian notion of atonement because it's effected solely through Christ and through his sacrifice.
The very thing in the New Testament is that people were expecting the Messiah to come and free them from political slavery, and so the very concept of what Jesus did was clearly not expected by the Jewish people even up to the time of Jesus' life.
Right. So when I look at the kinds of discussion in the Book of Mormon, it's very clear to me that it relies upon, if you will, more of a Methodist terminology. Joseph Smith, I think, was very partial to the Methodist, but it's a Wesleyan type of a view of salvation, and Wesleyan terminology is used throughout the Book of Mormon to talk about atonement in Christ and how people are saved from their fallen nature. The notion that humankind had a fallen nature from which they needed to be saved was not present in pre-exilic southern kingdom of Israel. So these kind of things suggest that at the very least that the language, and to some extent at least the concepts that are presented in the Book of Mormon, have been influenced by Joseph Smith's 19th century views of Christianity, and more in particular the Wesleyan tradition that we call Methodism.
Well, is that it? Is the book clearly the creation of a 19th century author? See, this is where the critics stop. They find the evidence that they want and go no further. But Blake and thoughtful saints keep looking, and what you find is what the critics never mention.
And let me emphasize, I had looked at everything that I could about the Book of Mormon and had largely come to the conclusion that it couldn't possibly be ancient given the modern language, the modern concepts and so forth, and the way that it expressed the very developed Christianity. But what brought me back is I looked at the evidence for its antiquity, which I found just couldn't be explained away easily on the theory that it was simply modern. So the first thing that I look at and that I find to be very compelling is that the Book of Mormon reflects an accurate understanding of covenant renewal festivals that existed in the pre-exilic Israelite world, and in particular the world of Judaism just before the Babylonian fall. It's very programmatic. There's a preamble identifying the author of the covenant, a historical prologue that enumerates the mighty deeds of God on behalf of his people, stipulations of a covenant, record of the covenant, and provisions for its preservation, a list of witnesses, and then curses and blessings. What you need to understand is that this covenant renewal was based upon covenant forms that were identified initially, I believe, by Mendenhall in 1955 when he was looking at essentially covenant treaties between Near Eastern countries or Near Eastern cities. And what he then noticed was that the same form existed in Israelite covenant renewal festivals and wrote about it in 1955. And so Mosiah 1 through 5 is a very good example of a covenant renewal festival. And I'm not the only one to recognize this, obviously. At least a dozen biblical scholars, people who are trained in biblical studies, read Hebrew like we read newspapers, and are very familiar with the evidence, have written and agreed that, this very closely reflects the covenant renewal tradition in ancient Israel. And so I asked myself, well, how likely is it that Joseph Smith would just stumble onto that? Now, there's some very Christian parts in the speech of King Benjamin as well. But the fact is that this pattern of covenant renewal is well recognized. And the thing is not only does it appear in Mosiah 1 through 5, it also appears in Mosiah 7 through 8, Mosiah 25, and again in 3rd Nephi when Christ comes and renews the covenant. And so it's like, well, gee, he did it once in remarkable detail, but maybe, anybody with a Bible in their hand could just reflect all of this pattern in fairly clear detail. But how many, he does it over and over again. And so I began to doubt that I could explain the Book of Mormon in terms of simply being a modern document because I found this evidence to be persuasive. I outlined the evidence. I still find it to be persuasive. Okay. And that has to do with the Covenant Renewal Festival.
Just to mention it there, it's not just the Covenant Renewal Festival, that there are also prophetic lawsuits, prophetic commissions. And so there's these types of ancient evidences as well throughout the Book of Mormon.
I think it's important to also recognize what I'm doing here is applying a recognized method of critical scholarship to tease out the ancient elements of a document that may also have more modern editorial involvement with the text, okay? Like the Bible, for instance. In the Bible, you have precisely this kind of thing happening where older texts are taken and repurposed and redacted and so forth. The scholars have used form critical evidence. Well, another form critical study shows that the elements of prophetic lawsuit, in order to bring a lawsuit, I mean, how do you bring a lawsuit in Israel is you go to the gates of the city, you crawl up on the gate, and you begin to yell your lawsuit at the people, okay? And then there are specific elements that have to be. You summon witnesses to appear and testify, and you make accusations in the name of God in order to establish what you've been wronged about. And a defense is sometimes offered that's implicit, and then a judgment is pronounced. And then a covenant is made regarding the resolution of the lawsuit. All of these are present at least 3 times in the Book of Mormon. And so what we get in the Book of Mormon is a repeated use of well-recognized form for bringing a lawsuit. In fact, there are 2 lawsuits brought by Abinadi in Mosiah, and then Samuel the Lamanite asserts a lawsuit that follows the form that is essential to bringing a lawsuit. Now, I can tell you that any American lawyer looking at a complaint could tell you essentially when the complaint is written because of the rules that apply at the time of filing the complaint. And so it's the same kind of thing here. There are specific types of rules in order to properly assert a lawsuit, and that's what this does. Now, I will say that one of the most convincing evidences of antiquity that I found is the prophetic commission and throne theophany in 1 Nephi. I wrote an article, was published in BYU Studies. There is a very clear pattern or form that was used by ancient prophets to establish them as a bona fide prophet called by the Council of God in Israel. And the book of 1 Nephi, the very first chapter, is a perfect example of such a form commission. And I took and compared this against the way that Joseph Smith presented his own experiences in the 19th century. What he presented followed a 19th century pattern when he talks about his first vision. Doesn't even remotely follow the ancient pattern. So when Joseph Smith talks about his own spiritual experiences, he places them within the context of a very formal nature of presenting one's spiritual visions in the 19th century. But the Book of Mormon doesn't follow the 19th century pattern at all. And so I think it's strong evidence of antiquity of the Book of Mormon.
The reality is that there is a shocking amount of evidence for antiquity in the Book of Mormon, and Blake is barely scratching the surface here. I will link below several videos that detail a mountain of compelling evidence for the book's antiquity. There was actually a time when, due to the Anachronisms, I thought that perhaps, at best, the Book of Mormon was some kind of an inspired fiction. But it was precisely looking into these evidences of antiquity that convinced me otherwise. But that leaves us with an interesting conundrum.
And so now I've got a problem. I have both modern and ancient in the Book of Mormon that needs to be explained. And so the question is, how do I explain that? How can I explain the fact that I have clear evidence of modern influence on the text? In fact, it relies on a text that couldn't possibly have been available to the writers of the Book of Mormon, the King James Bible. And how do I explain the evidence of antiquity in the Book of Mormon? So that was the question that I posed for myself as I carefully assessed the evidence.
So we have 2 elements present in the Book of Mormon: evidence of antiquity and evidence of modern influence. So how can these be reconciled? In what follows, Blake is actually describing a theory that he published back in 1987. It's called the expansion theory of translation, which I believe provides a compelling option for Latter-day Saints to consider. And it begins with understanding what it means to say that the Book of Mormon came forth by the gift and power of God and its connection to Revelation.
But the only way, because he didn't know ancient languages and because there couldn't be an isomorphic word one-for-one translation, the only way that this text of the Book of Mormon could have been received is through the divine gift of revelation. In fact, Joseph Smith made statements that the book was dictated directly to him through revelation. Not dictated, he didn't use the word dictated, but he received it directly, and that he dictated the text of the Book of Mormon. What I then wanted to ask is, well, okay, what's the nature of revelation then that he would be receiving? So I developed a theory of revelation that would account for Joseph Smith's revelatory activities.
Okay. And what does that theory of revelation consist of?
Well, the theory begins with the observation that revelation at least includes a human being, and it's a human experience. It includes both God and a person, but it's essentially a human experience. The second observation is that there can't be any human experience without interpretation. In other words, the very minute we begin to speak within a language, we've adopted already the interpretive framework of that language. And English has a different interpretive framework than Greek or ancient Hebrew or Russian. The framework for interpretation is different. But also, we live within a certain place and time. This is demonstrable in all the works of Scripture. The Scriptures are written by places within a specific time period, and their writings reflect that culture at that time. In fact, that's the very basis of critical biblical scholarship. That is the assumption from which all scholarship begins. And so, if we're looking at the Book of Mormon in this context, Joseph Smith is receiving a revelation, and the revelation is going to reflect the ancient text that is on the plates within the context and the language that he speaks, and his ability to understand the terminology and express it. Joseph Smith could not use a term that wasn't in his vocabulary, or if he did, he was stretching to try to explain what it was. So, for instance, if he used the term Deseret to explain a bee, nobody had ever done that before. He didn't understand what that was. Or a pacumen or a pacumeni. But the bottom line is that Joseph Smith had to use his own ability to understand his own terminology and speak within terms of his own cultural time. So when he speaks in the vernacular of not only the 1611 King James Bible, but also within the vernacular of the 19th century Methodism, which he knew best. And so what we get in the Book of Mormon, when phraseology is used and when explanation is given, that he is expressing it within those terms because those are the only terms available to him as a human being. And so this kind of interpretation is essential to the nature of revelation itself. There is no such thing as a revelation that is free of the influence of the culture, the language, and the time and place in which the prophet receiving the revelation exists, or indeed we ourselves when we receive personal revelation. There's no such thing as a pristine revelation from God's point of view. Revelation is received from a human point of view, inspired and enlightened by God. And so it becomes what I call a co-creative creation between a human being and God. So God provides, in essence, through the Spirit, the datum that is the context of the revelation. The human being provides the ability to understand, the ability to express within a specific language, the terminology, and one cannot transcend, in essence, one's own abilities within that context, except to the extent when we have new thoughts we stretch for, then we will see partly, but we'll have to express it in terms that aren't fully understandable to us, perhaps. I don't want to assert revelation can't reveal anything new that we haven't already known before. That's not what revelation is. But that in expressing a revelation, we use human language. And we have to look at the people to whom that revelation is directed. What can they understand? If Joseph Smith had expressed the Book of Mormon in terms of Mayan language and mythology, nobody would have been able to understand it, not merely in the 19th century, but now it would have been meaningless, literally meaningless to us. So rather, it's expressed in terms of the 19th century Methodism, which has, I think, been a very good vehicle for expressing the revelations in the Book of Mormon. Also, and this is important, we've talked about the scope of God's power and how he interacts with humans and leaves us free. Revelation, in Mormon thought at least, is not where the human being is simply overcome and God pours information into the human being and they speak out of a trance the very words that God, is speaking through them. Like in Independence Day, when the alien takes over, the scientist in the lab puts his, whatever that is, the alien has, he puts it on his throat, and the alien speaks through the human being. But it's not the human being speaking. The human being is already dead. That's not how we view it. Human beings are not dead in Revelation. They don't cease to exist in the Revelation. Indeed, it is their vocabulary and their thoughts that are being expressed. Now, I go beyond that and say, in order to adequately explain what we have in the Book of Mormon, there have to also be sections where Joseph Smith was explaining the text at length. And I give an example of this, not in the article, but later. There is a Hebrew term, chesed. Chesed means essentially covenant grace, the kind of loving tenderness as a gift that God gave to it. We would call this more or less a midrashic way of dealing with what Jesus was saying. Not only is what he said given, but the true meaning of what he said is given, and the way that it's revealed by the Spirit to them. In fact, the Gospel of John makes a point that the Spirit brought back to their recall, if though it were uttered at the time, when rather clearly it couldn't have been uttered with that kind of clarity, because if it were, the apostles had to be the biggest idiots who ever lived. Even the Gospel of John, Jesus doesn't really discuss the mysteries of the kingdom with them until chapters 14 through 17. And so even there, it's clear that the apostles are not understanding, at least during the time of his ministry before the last week of his life. But we get this, we would call this more or less a midrashic way of dealing with what Jesus was saying. Not only is what he said given, but the true meaning of what he said is given, and the way that it's revealed by the Spirit to them. In fact, the Gospel of John makes a point that the Spirit brought back to their recall what is being said in the Gospel of John. So this is a revelation, if you will, as to what actually happened in Jesus' life with the full meaning, the symbolic meaning. So if he gives somebody bread, as you said, he's not merely a person who's in Palestine eating bread. He is the very bread of life. If he gives somebody a drink from a well, it's not merely water drawn from a well. It is eternal life. It's the water that is going to bring eternal life to an individual. So the full understanding is imposed on earlier words, and what we get is an actualization of the text in light of the later understanding. What I assert is that with the Book of Mormon, we have the same kind of thing happening. Joseph Smith is translating what is happening in the sense that he's receiving a revelation of the text.
If you wouldn't mind, I'm just going to read the quote, because that all build-up was just so I could read this quote. So, quote is, "I suggest that we view the original ancient text of the Book of Mormon much as scholars view the expansion of the words of the historical Jesus in the New Testament." So just like we talked about, John did. So Joseph Smith gave us not merely the words of the Book of Mormon prophets, but also the true meaning of the text within a 19th century thought world. The translation was not merely from one language into another, but was also a transformation from one thought world to another that expands and explains the meaning of the original text in terms that Joseph Smith and his contemporaries would understand. Translation by the gift and power of God thus entails much more than merely rendering from one language to another.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Oh, hey, look at that.
Now, it should be noted that in the interview, Blake even admits that there are still meaningful questions and critiques to his theory. However, for me personally, I think it is a very compelling option for Latter-day Saints who recognize both modern and ancient elements in the Book of Mormon.
All right, just in summation, let me just read this last paragraph that you have, which I'll post a link to this as well. "I believe that the Book of Mormon is precisely what it claims to be. A book translated by the gift and power of God that tells us about the record of an ancient people. However, translation by the gift and power of God isn't translation based upon an isomorphic rendering of an underlying text into English based on a knowledge of the ancient textual language. Rather, it is a revelation from God which involves necessarily the limitations of vocabulary, conceptuality, and horizons of God's servants chosen to render it into English for us." And there you go. There's the theory.
Yep, there's the theory.
So do you enjoy the content here on Thoughtful Faith? If so, be sure to hit the notification bell. This ensures that our new videos show up on your feed. Also, be sure to check out our Facebook group called Thoughtful Saints, where myself and others discuss the sorts of topics found on this channel. And lastly, if you think other people would benefit from this video, please be sure to share it.